you, Iman. Thank you there, Kingsley Amayo. But staying in the U.S., we'll join Emmanuel Ogebe, a Nigerian who lives in Washington. Hello, Emmanuel.
Yes, hi.
How are you
Thanks
doing?
for having me on.
Thank you. Just tell us quickly, what's your mindset, and in the mindset of the Nigerians? Kingsley has just told us about the concerns of Nigerians there about the permanent voter cards, but about the excitement they have shown concerning the card readers that are being deployed for the elections. But what are the vibes you're getting from your end?
Well, you know, there's an African proverb that says you cannot give a man a haircut if he's not around. And so for us in the diaspora, if we're not participating in the vote, you know, we can't have as much impact as we would like. I think the key thing for many of us is this. We have advocated strongly for a diaspora vote, okay?
Yeah.
And frankly, if this had been allowed to take shape, then the Nigerians who are now refugees in Cameroon because of the crisis in the northeast would not have been disenfranchised. But we now have a situation, for example, where people who are IDPs, who are internally displaced within the country, have an advantage over their compatriots who became refugees and fled to Niger, Chad, and Cameroon. So clearly, there are many people who are disenfranchised, not just us who are in diaspora, but now even the Nigerians who were unfortunately made refugees because of the crisis in the northeast.
Okay, you said you've advocated for this over and over again, but seeing that now it's not done, I know that there are some Nigerians who are planning to travel back home, even if it is to observe the elections. But have you met with some like that, and why do they want to do that?
Well, I mean, frankly, I had a project called the Peaceful Polls Project, and I actually was in Nigeria to observe the polls myself, and then it was postponed. So I am one of those who has taken a very passionate interest in the situation. And we're observing the elections, and I can speak on behalf of my group, we're observing the elections with regard to post-election violence. Because not many people realize this, but Nigeria's 2011 elections were so violent that the figures and casualties compared with the elections of Kenya and the elections of Ivory Coast. The difference is that both Ivory Coast and Kenya ended up in the International Criminal Court. But Nigeria, no one ended up in the International Criminal Court. So the question really arises, what was the exception with Nigeria when as many lives, or almost as many lives, were lost compared to the other two examples that I gave you? But long and short of it, the reason why this election is critical for most of us in diaspora and for the international community is because it's a signal election. Let's make one thing clear. This election decides whether minorities can rule in Nigeria or whether only majorities can rule. This election decides whether only one half of the country can rule or everyone can rule. And so these are some of the foundational principles that this election will validate concerning our sense of nationhood in this country.
Well, before you joined us, we were talking about the existence of a viable opposition in the country. You said this election is a decider. I coined that one. It's going to decide a lot of things. But in your opinion, and from what you've seen, yes, you've been here to monitor the preparations and all that, do you think there's a viable opposition? My guest in the studio, well, they have mixed reactions, mixed comments and all of that. There's opposition, they are not viable, they are viable. But what's your take on that?
You know, I followed some of that dialogue, but let me say this, and let's be very clear. In Nigeria, we don't have an opposition. What we have is a reposition for a position.
In other words, hold on. You said reposition for a position.
Exactly. I mean, you look at individuals who leave the ruling party, reposition themselves so that they can come back to the ruling party for a position. That is essentially what we're having. We don't have a viable opposition. If you look at the history, and some of the panelists already said this, you look at the history of the people in the so-called opposition, and most of them, until very recently, were in the ruling party. So it's really an insult to our intellect for anyone to say that this is a genuine opposition. Apart from some elements of the Southwest which are genuinely and have consistently maintained an opposition identity. Most of the other members of the opposition crossed over overnight from the ruling party. So I think we need to stop deceiving ourselves in this country. This is not a real opposition in the true sense of the word. As one of your panelists said, you know, if you look at politics in the United States, the Democrats and Republicans can tell you specifically their agenda, their manifesto, their differences, their philosophical differences, their ideological differences. In Nigeria, you frankly do not have any such differences.
Okay.
There's corruption on both sides.
Okay, Emmanuel.
There's incompetence on both sides.
All right, Emmanuel, we want to thank you so much for joining us.